The city bustled with life, a blend of cultures and faces weaving through the streets. It was a typical afternoon in the heart of downtown, where the sounds of honking cars, distant chatter, and the hum of daily life created a constant rhythm. Amid the crowd, the presence of law enforcement officers stood out. They were a regular sight here, patrolling the streets, ensuring order, at least, on the surface. Officer John Smith drove slowly down the avenue, his gaze flicking from one passerby to the next. His face was stern, his jaw clenched in the usual impatience that had settled into him after years on the force. Smith had been a cop for over a decade, but despite his experience, there was something about this city's changing demographic that rubbed him the wrong way. He never said it aloud, but inside, he felt like the world around him was shifting in ways that made him uneasy. As his cruiser moved down the street, he grumbled under his breath, noticing a group of young black men talking on the corner. They weren't doing anything wrong, but Smith's instincts, or rather his prejudices, flared. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "This neighborhood's going to hell," he muttered to himself, fully unaware that his thoughts were rooted in biases he didn't even care to question. A few blocks away, Captain Angela Williams walked out of her apartment building. She had recently been promoted to captain, a well-earned position after years of service and dedication to the force. Today, though, she wasn't on duty. Dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, and sneakers, Williams blended in with the neighborhood. To any passerby, she looked like any other woman on her way to run an errand. But beneath the surface, she carried the weight of her position, and the struggles of being a black woman in a leadership role in the police force were always in the back of her mind. Despite her success, Williams often felt the silent battles she had to fight to prove herself. Today, however, was a rare moment of peace. She felt at home in her community, taking pride in walking among the people she had sworn to protect. Captain Williams walked down the familiar streets of her neighborhood, heading toward a local grocery store. It was a routine she enjoyed whenever she wasn't on duty, a simple act of blending in, where she could observe life from a distance without the weight of her badge. The city, in all its chaotic vibrance, was her home. She smiled to herself as she passed a few familiar faces and waved at a neighbor who nodded back. The air was crisp, and the sky was a clear, pale blue, offering a perfect day for a casual stroll. Yet, for Williams, it was also a moment of reflection. She thought about her journey in law enforcement, the challenges, the small victories, and the heavy moments of doubt. Being a black woman on the force hadn't been easy. She had faced more than her share of quiet resistance, the subtle racism that was often cloaked behind polite smiles and dismissive tones. She had worked twice as hard to reach where she was, but the promotion to captain had been worth it. Meanwhile, a few streets away, Officer Smith was already having a rough day. He had dealt with a few minor calls, disturbances, a petty theft at a convenience store, and an argument between two drivers. None of it was particularly challenging, but it had set him on edge. Something about the city today irritated him more than usual. As he turned the corner, his eyes locked on a figure walking in the distance, Williams. She caught his attention for no reason other than the color of her skin and the casual way she was dressed. His mind immediately jumped to conclusions, assumptions bubbling up without a shred of evidence. "What's she doing here?" he muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes. To him, a black woman walking casually through a middle-class neighborhood didn't fit the picture he had in his mind of what was normal. Dressed in civilian clothes, Williams didn't look like a high-ranking officer, and Smith's biases quickly filled in the blanks. He followed her with his eyes, his thoughts darkening as she continued walking. Another one of those welfare queens, probably, he thought, making no effort to question the racist stereotype forming in his mind. He was already suspicious, but it wasn't based on any real behavior, just his own prejudice. In his patrol car, Smith hesitated only briefly before he decided to act. He swerved the car over to the curb with a sudden jerk and got out, slamming the door behind him. His mind was already spinning with assumptions and the itch to assert his authority. He walked quickly toward Williams, his hand instinctively hovering near his belt, where his taser and firearm were holstered. The weight of the law felt heavy in his steps, but it was his own prejudices driving him, not the actual situation. Williams, meanwhile, hadn't noticed him yet. She was only a few blocks away from the store when she heard the sound of heavy boots behind her. She turned around slowly, her expression calm but alert. Her years of experience had taught her to read situations quickly. At first, she saw just a uniformed officer approaching her, and her instinct wasn't to worry. That was, until she saw his face. Officer Smith's face was twisted in a mix of disdain and self-righteousness. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone immediately authoritative. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Williams blinked, confused for a moment. The aggressive tone and unnecessary suspicion caught her off guard, but she quickly gathered herself. She offered a polite smile, though her eyes were serious. "I live here, officer. Just running an errand." Smith didn't believe her. He crossed his arms over his chest and glanced around the empty street as if looking for evidence to support his suspicions. "You live here?" His tone was incredulous, almost mocking. "Why don't you show me some ID? Prove it." Williams frowned but kept her composure. She reached for her back pocket, moving carefully. As a police officer herself, she knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. The last thing she wanted was for her own neighborhood to become the site of a violent confrontation, especially when she knew she was being targeted for nothing more than her skin color. Captain Williams handed over her ID with a steady hand, her expression neutral despite the rising tension. She could see the disdain in Officer Smith's eyes, the way he looked at her as though she was lying, as though she didn't belong here. Smith glanced at the ID, but he wasn't really reading it. His mind had already made up its story. A part of him wanted to escalate, to prove that his instincts were right, even though there was nothing suspicious about her behavior. "You know," Smith said, his voice laced with skepticism, "I've been working this beat for years, and I've never seen you around. You sure this is your neighborhood?" His words were biting, challenging her right to exist in the space he patrolled. Williams could feel her patience thinning, but she kept her composure. "I've lived here for a while, officer. I don't usually walk around in uniform, if that's what you mean." Her tone was firm, but not confrontational. She was trying to de-escalate, though it was clear to her now that Smith wasn't looking for a calm resolution. Smith, however, wasn't interested in reason. He squared his shoulders, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Yeah, well, that's not good enough. You seem pretty nervous for someone just out for a stroll. What are you really doing here?" His voice grew louder, more aggressive, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. Williams took a breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her. This wasn't just about her, this was about every interaction like this, every moment when someone was judged based on their race rather than their actions. She could sense the danger rising, but she refused to let fear dictate her response. "I told you," Williams replied, her voice calm but firmer now. "I live here. There's no reason for you to treat me like a suspect." That was when Smith snapped. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm roughly. "I'm going to need you to cooperate," he barked, as if she hadn't already been doing exactly that. The sudden escalation took Williams by surprise. She stumbled back slightly, her face hardening. Around them, a small crowd had started to gather, people pulling out their phones, recording the scene. Williams pulled her arm free, her movements controlled, not wanting to escalate the situation further, but her voice was sharp now. "I'm asking you to let go of me, officer." But Smith wasn't listening. His face was red with anger, and in a split second, he reached for his taser, brandishing it in front of her. "You want to resist? Fine. Let's see how that works out for you." The crowd gasped, murmurs of disbelief spreading as they watched the scene unfold. One woman's voice rang out above the rest, "She didn't do anything. Leave her alone." Williams stood her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. "You're making a mistake, officer. I'm not resisting. But you're about to cross a line." Smith's eyes flashed with anger, his grip tightening on the taser as if daring her to make a move. To him, this was about control, about proving that he was in charge. And in his mind, she was just another civilian who needed to be put in her place. As the tension mounted, Williams made one last effort to de-escalate. "Officer, you don't know who I am. I'm asking you to stop before this gets worse for you." But Smith didn't back down. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're another one of those types who think they can do whatever they want and get away with it. Well, not on my watch." He moved closer, the taser still in hand, as though preparing to use it. The crowd grew louder, more voices shouting now, trying to stop what was clearly a wrongful escalation. But Smith was too far gone in his anger, too deep in his need to assert power. Williams, feeling the situation slipping further out of control, took a deep breath. "You've just assaulted a superior officer," she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. For a moment, there was silence. Smith blinked, the words not quite registering. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low, as though daring her to repeat it. Williams took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I said, you've just assaulted your captain." The tension in the air seemed to freeze. Officer Smith stood there, blinking in disbelief. For a brief moment, the words didn't fully register, his mind too clouded with adrenaline and the need to assert dominance. But then, as the seconds passed, the reality of what Captain Williams had just said began to sink in. "Your captain," he repeated, his voice quieter now, but still dripping with disbelief. His grip on the taser loosened slightly, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his eyes. Captain Williams stood her ground, her expression firm, her voice unwavering. "That's right, officer. I'm Captain Angela Williams. I lead this precinct. And right now, you're assaulting your commanding officer." The color drained from Smith's face as the weight of her words finally hit him. He staggered back a step, the taser still in his hand, but his once confident stance crumbled into shock. The crowd, which had been murmuring and filming the entire time, collectively gasped. Some bystanders even whispered among themselves, repeating, "Did she say she's the captain?" In the midst of his panic, Smith glanced over at one of the officers who had arrived during the commotion. It was Officer Hernandez, who had been watching from a few feet away, his face a mixture of shock and dread. Hernandez, unlike Smith, knew exactly who Captain Williams was. Hernandez stepped forward quickly, his face pale. "Smith, what are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, his voice filled with urgency. "That's Captain Williams. Put the taser down." Smith's hand trembled, the taser slipping from his grip and clattering onto the pavement. His face turned a deep shade of red, not from anger now, but from a humiliation so intense that it felt like the ground beneath him was giving way. He looked between Hernandez and Williams, searching desperately for some sort of explanation, some way to justify what he had done. But there was nothing. No excuse could make this right. The crowd grew even larger as more people gathered, drawn by the murmurs and the flashes of phone cameras capturing every second of the incident. Williams, though still calm, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew what this incident would mean, not just for her, but for the entire department, for the community, and for Officer Smith's career. Smith's voice cracked as he finally spoke, the bravado gone. I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I thought." "You thought what?" Williams interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in her tone was unmistakable. "That I didn't belong here. That I was a threat because of the color of my skin." Smith couldn't find the words to respond. He stood there, his mind racing, but everything he had planned to say, everything he had assumed about the situation, had fallen apart. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was utterly speechless. Hernandez stepped forward again, placing a hand on Smith's arm as if to pull him back from the edge of further disgrace. "Captain Williams," Hernandez said softly, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed her. I'm so sorry. He didn't know it was you." Williams turned to Hernandez, her expression softening slightly. She knew Hernandez, knew he was one of the good officers in the precinct. But that didn't change what had just happened. It didn't change the fact that Smith had attacked her without reason, without cause, other than his own prejudice. "This isn't about whether he knew who I was," Williams said, her voice measured. "It's about why he thought it was okay to treat me, or anyone, like this. This could have been any black woman walking down the street today. And how would it have ended then?" Hernandez bowed his head, understanding the gravity of her words. Around them, the crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising in anger and disbelief at the situation they had just witnessed. Some shouted, demanding justice, while others stood in stunned silence, their cameras still recording. Smith, still frozen in place, looked like a man who had just seen his entire world collapse in an instant. He knew the consequences were inevitable, that there was no walking away from this. The truth was already out, caught on dozens of cameras and witnessed by countless people. This section focuses on the pivotal moment where Smith realizes his catastrophic mistake. The confrontation shifts from one of authority to a moment of utter shock and humiliation as Smith understands the weight of his actions. Captain Williams, though calm, delivers a powerful message, making it clear that the issue goes beyond just her rank, it's about the systemic biases that led to the incident in the first place. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and undeniable. Within minutes, more officers arrived at the scene, responding to the calls of concerned bystanders who had witnessed the tense exchange. The crowd continued to murmur, their phones still aimed at Officer Smith, whose face was now pale with dread. His hands trembled as he stood frozen in place, his mind racing through the consequences he knew were about to unfold. Captain Williams, still calm and composed, stepped back from Smith. Her heart was pounding, but she knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was a moment that represented something far bigger, a moment that shone a light on the deep, ingrained biases that officers like Smith carried with them on the job. And now, the world would see it too. Williams straightened her shoulders and addressed Hernandez. "Take him in," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes were tired. "He's not fit for duty." There was no room for argument in her tone. Hernandez hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He turned to Smith, his voice low but firm. "Smith, hand over your badge and weapon." Smith's breath hitched. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment crushing him from all sides. "But, Captain," he stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought." "You thought wrong," Williams interrupted, her gaze piercing through him. "What you did was reckless. And it wasn't just about me being your captain. It was about the assumptions you made, the prejudice that guided your actions. You saw a black woman and assumed the worst. That's the problem. Smith opened his mouth to argue, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had acted on impulse, fueled by his own biases, and now, he was facing the consequences. Slowly, with shaking hands, he unhooked his badge from his chest and handed it to Hernandez, followed by his gun. As Hernandez placed them in an evidence bag, the reality of the situation sank in. Smith's career, his reputation, his life, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before his eyes. And there was no one to blame but himself. The video footage from the bystanders had already started making rounds on social media. By the time Smith was taken away in the back of a squad car, the incident had gone viral. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story, and the hashtag Captain Williams trended across platforms. The city was buzzing with outrage, and protests demanding justice for systemic racism in the police force erupted in various neighborhoods. For Williams, the situation became a delicate balance between her role as a leader in law enforcement and her personal experience as a black woman who had just been targeted by one of her own officers. She had spent years working to build trust between the police and the community, and now, that trust was in jeopardy. In the days that followed, Williams found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters and activists wanted statements. The community wanted accountability. The police department faced pressure from both internal and external forces to act swiftly and decisively. Smith was suspended indefinitely, pending an internal investigation. But the damage to his career had already been done. His name was plastered across headlines, and his face was recognized everywhere. He became a symbol of everything wrong with the system, one more officer whose implicit biases had caused harm. Sitting in his apartment, Smith couldn't escape the constant reminders of his downfall. Every time he turned on the TV or checked his phone, there it was, his name, his actions, his mistake. The videos of the incident had been viewed millions of times, and the public's condemnation was overwhelming. His own family distanced themselves, embarrassed and disappointed by what he had done. The weight of it all was suffocating. He spent sleepless nights replaying the moment in his head. He hadn't seen it coming. How could he have been so blind? He had thought of himself as a good cop, someone who kept the streets safe, but now he was forced to confront the truth. His prejudices had clouded his judgment. He had acted on impulse, driven by biases he didn't even realize he had. And now, it had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Captain Williams stood at the podium in a packed press conference, facing both the media and her fellow officers. Her expression was resolute, her voice firm as she addressed the crowd. "This incident is not just about one officer's mistake," she began. "It's about the systemic issues that we, as a society and as a police force, must confront. Officer Smith's actions were rooted in bias, but they're not an isolated case. Too many people in our communities, particularly black and brown individuals, face this kind of treatment every day. It has to stop." Her words echoed through the room, and for a moment, there was silence. Williams took a breath and continued, "As officers, we have a responsibility to protect and serve all members of our community, not just those who look or act a certain way. This is a moment of reckoning, not just for our department, but for law enforcement across the country." The crowd erupted into applause, and the cameras flashed as Williams stepped down from the podium. She had made her statement clear, but she knew that real change would take more than just words. It would take action, systemic reform, training, accountability. Back in his apartment, Smith watched the press conference, the weight of his actions sinking even deeper. He had lost his career, his reputation, and the respect of his peers. But more than that, he had lost the trust of the people he was supposed to protect. He knew now that there was no going back to the life he once had. The only thing left was to face the consequences and, perhaps, begin the long road to understanding where he had gone wrong. In the weeks that followed the incident, the city was still buzzing with the reverberations of what had taken place. The video of Captain Williams being harassed by one of her own officers became a focal point in the ongoing national conversation about race, policing, and systemic inequality. Protests, some peaceful and others more heated, continued to demand justice, not just for Captain Williams, but for every person of color who had been mistreated under the same system. Within the police department, the fallout from the incident triggered a wave of internal reviews and new policies. The chief of police held meetings with community leaders, activists, and officers to begin discussions on real, lasting reforms. Diversity and bias training became mandatory, but there was still much work to be done. Captain Williams knew that these steps, while important, were only the beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight. One day, as Williams walked through the precinct, she reflected on how far she had come, and how far the force still had to go. Her career had been marked by triumphs and challenges, but this incident had pushed her to the forefront of a movement much larger than herself. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, but she knew she had a responsibility to use it to spark meaningful change. She entered the precinct's main office, where a meeting with her officers was about to take place. This wasn't just a regular briefing, it was a pivotal moment for the department. Every officer in the precinct, including those who had watched the incident unfold, sat in their chairs, waiting for Williams to speak. Some of them were nervous, unsure of what she would say. Others were ready to take accountability and learn from the mistakes that had been made. Williams stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of her officers. Some were seasoned veterans like Smith, who had their own deeply ingrained beliefs. Others were rookies, just starting out, still full of idealism and hope for what law enforcement could be. She knew that her words today would set the tone for the department's future. She began to speak, her voice steady and clear. "What happened that day was a failure of our system," she said, locking eyes with each officer. "It was a failure of judgment, a failure of leadership, and a failure of trust. But it wasn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of the deeper issues that we need to confront as a department, and as a society." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Williams took a deep breath before continuing. "We've talked about reform, and we've talked about training. But real change comes from within each of us. It's not just about policies and procedures, it's about how we see each other, how we treat each other, and how we uphold the values of justice and equality in everything we do." She paused, letting the message resonate. "I've spent my career working to build trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. That trust is fragile, and it can be broken in a moment, as we've seen. But it can also be rebuilt, with accountability, with honesty, and with a commitment to doing better." One of the younger officers raised his hand. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Captain, how do we start to fix this? How do we make things right?" Williams smiled gently, her eyes softening. "We start by acknowledging our own biases," she said. "We start by listening, really listening, to the communities we serve, and by holding each other accountable when we fall short. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if we're committed to real change, we can make it happen." As the meeting continued, Williams felt a sense of hope. It wasn't a false hope, it was grounded in the hard work that lay ahead. She knew that not everyone in the room was ready for change, and some might never be. But there were enough who were willing to do the work, to push forward, and to be part of the solution. Outside the precinct, life continued to move on, but there was a shift in the air. The community, once divided by mistrust, was beginning to see the effects of Williams' leadership. Meetings between officers and community members were becoming more frequent, and slowly, bridges were being built. People began to feel heard, and the dialogue that had been missing for so long was finally starting to take place. As for Officer Smith, his life had taken a drastic turn. After his suspension, the internal investigation concluded with his termination. Smith, once a respected figure in his precinct, now found himself ostracized and alone. He moved out of the city, unable to bear the constant reminders of his actions. The videos, the articles, the protests, they haunted him, replaying in his mind over and over. For a long time, Smith had avoided reflecting on the deeper reasons behind his actions that day. But in the quiet of his new, isolated life, he couldn't escape the truth anymore. He knew now that his prejudices had been a blind spot, something he had never truly confronted. The anger he had felt wasn't just directed at Williams, it was rooted in something much darker, something that had been festering in him for years. Smith would never be able to undo the damage he caused, but he knew that if he ever wanted to move forward, he needed to face the truth about himself. It would be a long, painful journey, but it was one he had to take alone. Months later, Captain Williams stood in front of a newly graduated group of officers. She had been invited to give the keynote address at their graduation ceremony. The faces looking up at her were full of hope, excitement, and a desire to make a difference. As she spoke, she couldn't help but think back to her own early days on the force. Back then, she had been one of the few women of color in her precinct, and the challenges had been many. But standing here now, as a captain, speaking to the next generation of officers, she felt a sense of accomplishment, not just for herself, but for the progress that had been made. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But the journey isn't over. It's your responsibility now to carry the torch forward, to be the officers this community needs, and to build trust where it's been broken. Remember that justice is more than just enforcing the law, it's about treating every person with dignity and respect, no matter who they are." The room erupted into applause as Williams finished her speech. She smiled, knowing that while the road ahead was still long, there was hope for a brighter future, one where officers like Smith would be the exception, not the norm. And she was ready to keep fighting for that future, one step at a time. Hello everyone. I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you for watching the entire video. Your support means a lot to me and motivates me to keep creating content. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. Don't forget to leave your comments and share your thoughts. Until next time. Thank you.